Chapter 35. Carry. Flashback. Present. The gift of speech was a beautiful infection caught from a companion who refused to remain silent. Ertan's personal journals. Entry 67. Dr. Elena Vasquez slept against the trunk of the withered tree. It was not a deep sleep. It was the careful armed sleep of a woman who had been dormant inside a monster for 6 months. Her head was tipped to the right. Her left hand lay open on her thigh. Her right hand was loose around the haft of the knife, but had not let it go. Ertan watched her from across the hall for a long, quiet count while strolling with 1080 around the palace, or House of Prayers, to capture the mists talking so the wolf could analyze and learn their language. Yet he wanted very much to know who Elena was.
Titi.
Yes.
You said you have her files, her records, the data you carried for her.
Yes.
Will you tell me about her?
The wolf's eye lamps brightened by 1/4 tone.
I can tell you. There is a difficulty.
What difficulty?
The records I hold are private.
And?
Privacy is very important. But given the situation and the tension between you two...
Tension?
Yes. She does not fully trust you, but there is a certain urgency for cooperation. If you give me your word that what I will tell you will not be used against her, I will tell you.
I swear on my parents' sacrifice. Then tell me 1080. From the beginning, from her side.
The wolf settled on its haunches. The eye lamps dimmed to a soft, thoughtful gold.
Listen and try to understand.
Elena Vasquez was looking at the data, and the data was looking back. It filled every screen in her office. 6 monitors arranged in a semicircle around her desk like the panels of a confession booth. Each one dense with numbers and graphs and spectral analyses that taken individually made perfect sense and taken together described the impossible. Gravity anomalies in the Mariana Trench, electromagnetic field inversions across the Sahara, a patch of ocean off the coast of Iceland where the laws of thermodynamics had simply decided to stop applying for 72 hours, boiling the surface water while simultaneously freezing everything below 50 meters. The ocean had steamed and iced at the same time, and a fishing fleet had watched their catches float upward into the sky while their hulls accumulated frost. She pushed her wheelchair back from the desk and reached for the water bottle on the shelf behind her. The movement was practiced economical, the kind of physical efficiency that comes not from training, but from a lifetime of navigating a world built for people whose legs worked. She unscrewed the cap with her teeth because her left hand was holding a pen and her right was already reaching back toward the nearest keyboard. She drank without looking away from the screen that showed the Secretary General of the United Nations, a tall, cunning-looking man, smooth-voiced with eyes that held a half-smile they had not earned, claiming these corruptions of the planet were the way of global warming and urging governments to take action.
Once again, idiots.
The water was lukewarm. Everything in this building was lukewarm. The air conditioning at the Nevada facility had been designed for a staff of 40 and was now servicing 312 researchers, military liaisons, political observers, and the small army of support personnel that accumulates around any project the world's governments decide to take seriously. The coolers never had enough time to cool the water. The hallways smelled of recycled air and anxiety and the particular brand of instant coffee that the American military had been inflicting on scientists since the 1960s. Elena set the bottle down and rubbed her eyes. She had been staring at screens for 14 hours. Her lower back ached, the deep, familiar ache that lived in the base of her spine like a tenant who had moved in at birth and refused to leave. Her legs, thin and motionless beneath the desk, had long since stopped registering even the phantom sensations that had occasionally troubled her in childhood. They were simply there. 2 limbs that belonged to her body the way an unplugged lamp belongs to a room. Present, useless, accounted for. She had been born with them broken, or rather, born with the instructions for building them written wrong in her DNA. Spinal muscular atrophy. The doctors at the hospital Giral de Bonsucesso in North Rio had told her father when she was 4 years old, speaking slowly and carefully in the manner of people delivering news they expected to be received with grief. Her father, Marcos Vasquez, had listened with the grave attention of a man accustomed to receiving bad news because bad news was the principal currency of Favela do Alemão, The sprawling hillside slum in Rio's north zone where Elena had drawn her first breath on a mattress laid across two wooden pallets while rain hammered the corrugated tin roof and the electricity flickered. Marcos had carried her. She never knew her mother. She had lost the battle against postpartum depression after Elena's birth, and her father never married again. That was the fact of Elena's childhood, the bedrock truth beneath everything that came after. Her father carried her. He was not a large man. 5'6", thin in the way that poverty makes people thin, with calloused hands from 2 decades of construction work and the back that had begun to curve by the time Elena was 10. He carried her on his shoulders through the narrow, steep alleys of the favela, where the steps were too uneven for a wheelchair and the inclines too sharp for crutches. He carried her to the Escola Municipal, 3 kilometers away, because the school in their own neighborhood had no ramp and no elevator and no interest in accommodating a child who could not walk. He carried her home again in the afternoon, stopping at the fruit stand on Rua Barao de Mesquita to buy her a mango. If his pockets held enough coins, and if they did not, he told her the mangoes looked wormy that day, and she pretended to believe him. He carried her to the Biblioteca Estadual when she was 7 and had read every book the Escola could provide. He carried her up 4 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken and had been broken for 2 years and would remain broken for 3 more. He set her down at a table near the window where the light was good and went to wait in the lobby because Marcos Vasquez did not read well and felt out of place among so many words, but understood that his daughter did not, and that understanding was enough. He carried her to the entrance exam for the Colegio Pedro II when she was 12, the most prestigious public school in Rio where the children of professors and politicians sat alongside scholarship students and pretended the distinction did not matter. The exam was in a building with a ramp, and Marcos pushed her wheelchair up it with the careful, deliberate focus of a man entering a cathedral. She scored first in mathematics, first in physics, fourth in Portuguese, which annoyed her because the essay prompt had been about personal hardship and she had written about quantum mechanics instead. He carried her until she could carry herself, and then she did. Elena closed her eyes and pressed her fingertips against her eyelids until bright shapes bloomed in the darkness. She could still feel him. 5 years since the pancreatic cancer had taken him in a hospital bed that his daughter's money had paid for in a private room that his daughter's fame had secured, she could still feel the rhythm of his walking, the slight hitch in his left step where his knee had been injured in a construction accident, the warmth of his hands around her calves as he steadied her on his shoulders. He had never once complained. He had never once asked her to be grateful. He had simply carried her the way the ground carries a tree, without commentary or expectation of thanks.
Papai, the world is breaking and I do not know how to fix it.
She opened her eyes and looked at the data again. The anomalies had been growing for 2 decades. Elena had been tracking them since her doctoral work at MIT, where she had arrived at 24 on a full scholarship and a Brazilian government grant and the barely concealed skepticism of a faculty that saw a wheelchair and assumed the university was filling a quota. Her thesis advisor, a celebrated theorist named Morrison who had won his Nobel before Elena was born, had assigned her a research topic he considered safely trivial, cataloging electromagnetic anomalies in deep ocean trenches. Busy work. A project that would produce a perfectly adequate dissertation without requiring Morrison to invest any of his dwindling attention in a student he had not chosen, and did not expect to impress him. Elena had taken his busy work and dismantled the foundations of modern physics with it. The anomalies were not random. That was her first insight, published at 25 in a paper that Morrison refused to co-author because he did not believe the conclusions and did not wish to be associated with what he called in a departmental meeting. He thought she could not hear the wheelchair girl's science fiction. The anomalies followed a pattern. They clustered at specific coordinates, recurred at measurable intervals, and increased in intensity along a curve that Elena's models predicted with unsettling accuracy. Something was bleeding through into their reality from somewhere else, and it was getting worse. Her second insight came 3 years later, after she had left MIT for CERN, with a speed that left Morrison blinking and the physics department scrambling to claim credit for her work. The energy signatures of the anomalies did not match any known physical process, not nuclear, not electromagnetic, not gravitational. They were something else, something that operated according to rules that Elena's equations could describe but not explain, the way Newtonian mechanics can describe the orbit of a planet without explaining why gravity exists. The energy was real, it was measurable, and it behaved as though it were conscious. She had not used that word in the published paper. She had written exhibiting non-random responsive patterns consistent with complex adaptive systems. The peer reviewers had accepted this phrasing, the popular press had translated it as ghost energy, which Elena despised, and the Vasquez feel, which she found only slightly less objectionable. The data on her screens that night was the latest iteration of 8 years of tracking. The anomalies had accelerated. What had once been a slow drift, a degree of warming per decade, had become an avalanche. In the past 6 months, 14 major metropolitan areas had experienced what the media now called reality breaks, zones where the fundamental constants of physics altered without warning or explanation. In Manila, gravity had inverted over a 16-block radius for 40 minutes. 11,000 people had fallen upward into the sky. Most had survived because the inversion reversed before they reached lethal altitude. Some had not. In Lagos, the electromagnetic field had collapsed across the harbor, wiping every electronic device in a 3-kilometer radius and plunging the city into a darkness that lasted 9 hours. 3 hospitals had lost power. The death toll was still being calculated. In Buenos Aires, her home continent, a reality break had manifested as a thermal anomaly that froze the Rio de la Plata solid in midsummer. 2 cargo ships had been trapped. One had cracked in half as the ice expanded through its hull. And those were only the ones that made the news. The ocean anomalies, the ones that had started everything, were immeasurably worse. Entire currents were shifting. Marine ecosystems were collapsing in zones where the water's chemical properties changed overnight. The Atlantic conveyor belt, the great ocean current that regulated Europe's climate, had stuttered twice in the past year. If it stopped, the northern hemisphere would enter a new ice age within a decade. Helena took another drink of lukewarm water and set the bottle down with a precision that betrayed the tremor in her hands. She was tired. Not the healthy fatigue of hard work well done, but the bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who had been running toward a cliff for 8 years and could now see the edge. She had built the case. Paper by paper, conference by conference, government hearing by government hearing. She had assembled the evidence and presented it to every authority that would listen and several that would not. The United Nations. The G20. The newly formed Global Anomaly Response Committee, which had the resources of a small nation and the decision-making speed of continental drift. She had spoken to presidents and prime ministers and defense secretaries. Although the Secretary General of the United Nations dismissed her ideas, some started to listen. Eventually, after Manila, they had listened. After Lagos, they had funded. After Buenos Aires, they had mobilized. The Quantum Breach Initiative was Elena's design from first principles to final blueprint. A dimensional probe powered by the most advanced quantum tunneling array ever constructed, capable of penetrating the barrier between their reality and whatever lay beyond it. Not a weapon, not a shield, a doorway, because Elena Vasquez had looked at the data for 8 years and concluded with the cold certainty that was her particular gift and her particular curse, that the anomalies could not be stopped from this side. The pressure was coming from elsewhere, and the only way to relieve pressure was to go to its source. She had lobbied for the funding in 4 languages across 3 continents. She had fought through committees that wanted to weaponize the probe, through politicians who wanted to delay until after elections, through military advisors who wanted to send missiles through the breach before anyone bothered to look through it. She had fought through the quieter, more insidious resistance of colleagues who believed, without saying so directly, that a paraplegic woman from a Brazilian favela was not the right face for humanity's most important scientific endeavor. They never said it plainly. They said logistics. They said operational efficiency. They said the terrain on the other side is unknown and we need team members who can respond to physical threats. One general, a man with 3 stars and the diplomatic finesse of a sledgehammer, had looked at her wheelchair during a planning session and asked with the tone of someone raising a perfectly reasonable concern, "Dr. Vasquez, have you considered that your personal involvement might compromise the expedition's mobility?"
I designed the probe. I designed the breach protocols. I designed the containment algorithms. I designed the navigation system. I designed the analytical framework that will allow us to interpret whatever we find on the other side. If you can find someone who can do all of those things and also walk general, I encourage you to hire them.
The general had not raised the subject again. But others had, especially the Secretary General of the United Nations, in smaller rooms and private conversations in the careful coded language of people who understood that explicit discrimination was illegal and implicit discrimination was simply how things worked. You would be much more valuable as an overseer. Director Chen had told her 2 weeks before the expedition's launch in his office at the Nevada facility with its view of nothing but sand and chain-link fence. Director Chen was appointed by the G20 to oversee her by suggestion from China and the USA. Chen was not a bad man, he was a cautious man, which in Elena's experience was often worse.
Your expertise is irreplaceable, Elena. If something happens to you in the field, we lose our greatest asset. Surely you can see the logic.
She could see the logic. She had been seeing the logic her entire life. The logic that said a girl from Alamau did not belong at Pedro II. The logic that said a minority in a wheelchair did not belong in engineering, let alone MIT. The logic that said a young woman with dark skin and dead legs did not belong at the front of the room when the fate of the world was being decided. The logic was always impeccable. The logic was always wrong.
Director Chen, let me explain something about the probe. The dimensional breach is not a door that you open and walk through. It is a wound in reality that must be navigated in real time using quantum state calculations that no computer on Earth can perform without human interpretive input. The breach protocols require someone who understands at an intuitive level the mathematics of dimensional superposition. There are 4 people alive who possess that understanding. I am one of them. The other 3 are members of my team and have already requested that I lead them in person.
She paused.
The expedition needs a physicist who can think in impossible situations. It does not need a physicist who can jog.
She breathed out.
Honestly, we cannot take the risk of opening the tunnel again and again. We might trigger something we do not understand. This might be our only chance, and I want to be there.
Chen had rubbed his forehead. He was a man who recognized an immovable object when he encountered one.
The committee will have concerns.
The committee always has concerns. Addressing them is your job. Getting through the breach and finding the source of the anomalies is mine.
She had won. Of course she had won. Elena Vasquez had been winning arguments against people who underestimated her since before she could read, which was to say since before she was 4 years old, because she had taught herself to read at 3 from a water-damaged encyclopedia her father had rescued from a construction site's garbage pile. She won because she was right, and because she refused to stop, and because her father had taught her without ever putting it into words that the world would carry you only if you demanded it, and that the demanding never stopped, and that this was not a tragedy, but simply the cost of being alive. What winning Elena had learned was not the same as being safe, and being right was not the same as being ready. She turned back to her screens. The latest data from the CERN probe showed the breach expanding at a rate that her models had predicted for 18 months from now. They were ahead of schedule, and in this context, ahead of schedule meant closer to catastrophe. The energy readings from beyond the breach were intensifying. The anomaly, whatever it was not just leaking through, it was pushing. Something on the other side was under pressure, and the barrier between realities was the only thing holding it back, and the barrier was failing. Her hand found the small framed photograph she kept beside her secondary monitor. It showed a thin man with calloused hands and a curved back standing in front of a building with a ramp squinting into the sun with an expression that might have been pride and might have been the simple relief of a father who had carried his daughter as far as he could and had arrived finally at a place where she could carry herself. Marcos Vasquez had died, believing that his daughter would fix whatever needed fixing. He had said so in the hospital in the last coherent conversation they had shared, his hand dry and light in hers, his voice reduced to a whisper that carried more weight than any general's command.
Elenina, you killed lions every day. This is just a 3-headed lion. It might be difficult, but ask for help if you need it. You do not need to do it alone.
She had not corrected him. She had not said that the world was breaking in ways that might be beyond figuring out. She had held his hand and let him believe, because belief was the last gift she could give him. And because in the deepest part of her, the part that a favela and a wheelchair and 40 years of being told no had forged into something harder than any metal her engineers could produce, she believed it too. Elena Vasquez set down the photograph, turned back to the data, and began to plan the expedition that would carry her into the space between worlds. She would walk through the breach, not on her legs. She had never needed those. She would walk on her mind as she had always walked, carried by the strength of a man who had never once put her down. A knock at the door of Elena's office. Director Chen entered. He looked more modest than usual.
Doctor, may I come in?
Please.
First of all, I wanted you to know I am not going to apologize for my behavior leading up to this. Since you have been chosen to lead the expedition, I just have to know.
Know what?
That no matter what, you will defend our planet.
Course I will. What kind of?
Please, I do not mean just physically. I mean philosophically. I mean spiritually. I mean against gods.
Sorry?
Helena winced.
The place you will be going. Let us be honest. No one knows what is out there. From tiny little aliens to earth-shattering gods, anything might be out there.
Director.
I just need to know.
He looked deeply into her eyes.
You will defend us, no matter what.
Elena's heart suddenly boiled with passion. She put on her stern face.
I will. And I made that promise a long time ago to a more important person than any god.
Director Chen took a deep breath. He turned to the lab door.
Guys, bring it in.
2 interns she had seen around Director Chen opened the door. A walking robot entered. A walking assistant unit marketed around the world. The newer model, the successor. The one the engineering team had been modifying for the last 2 months on the bench, 3 doors down from her own. Model Wolf installed with version 10.8.
10 IT. Director, these will not.
Please, Doctor, let me.
He cut Elena off.
I know these are somehow for show, and their range is short, and they require constant charging. But the engineering department had ideas. Apparently, you were an advisor on the AI model Autonom. They integrated their new model with this 10 IT. Also, I called some friends. We got an enormous gift from China. Now it has a functioning fusion core. It can last 1,000 years. Even if our expedition perishes, it will gather data for the next group. It is fitting equipment for our lead.
He nodded to the air.
What do you say?
I do not know what to say, thank.
Her eyes watered.
Thank you. You can be sure I will defend our planet no matter what.
It was ready. She was ready. The world was breaking and Elena Vasquez was going to carry it. The wolf was quiet for a long time. Ertan on the cold, polished stone of the great hall with the small, thin echo of an old AI's last chirp still in the back of his ear, and the woman in the wheelchair at the dying father's bedside still in the front of his eyes did not for a long count breathe. Ertan looked across the hall. The woman against the trunk had not moved. The right hand loose around the haft of the rusted knife had not let it go.